Imagine this. It's the middle of winter and all across North Yorkshire, a brutal blizzard is sweeping across everything in its path. And out there, a ship has run aground. The storm is too violent to launch a lifeboat where they are, so they send word 6 miles away to here in Whitby. They can't launch a lifeboat here because the sea is also horrible. So their only choice is to carry it 6 miles to Robin Hood's Bay. This is the incredible story of the 1881 Robin Hood's Bay lifeboat rescue. Out off the North Yorkshire coast was a local ship, a brig called the Visitor. As with the many other ships that had been struggling in this same storm, the Visitor found herself in trouble. She found herself being smashed onto the rocks in Robin Hood's Bay, and very quickly the ship began to break apart, at which point the crew had very little choice but to get into the ship's one small lifeboat. Now, they weren't far from the coast, and so their hopes may have been to try and navigate this small lifeboat ashore through these unforgiving waves, or to have been spotted by somebody on the coast who would sound the alarm. But, unfortunately for them, all of this was happening early in the morning, before the sun had risen. And so not only were they stuck in a tiny lifeboat in rolling, powerful waves, but they could barely see. And that was the same for anyone who happened to be standing on the coast nearby. Nobody could see them, and nobody knew that they were in trouble. And it was only hours later, with the men still clinging to life in this small boat, that somebody spotted what was happening and called the alarm. And it was also only at this point that the crew really discovered the intensity of their predicament. They could see even clearer how rocky Robin Hood's Bay was, and that there was little chance, especially in this storm, of them being able to navigate their way through the rocks to the beach. And so all they could do was wait. Just offshore, beyond the rocks, all they could do was try and keep their lifeboat afloat. But they were being smashed continuously by huge waves, and at this point snow blizzards that had swept into the area. These were nightmarish conditions. But there was even worse news to come. The local lifeboat at Robin Hood's Bay was not seaworthy. And at this point the storm was so strong and so bad that nobody local was willing to go out and try to aid the men. And so they realized that they needed help. The first coastal town that also had a lifeboat that they contacted was Scarborough. They sent a telegram which was received by a Commander Grant. But at this point in Scarborough, all of the tugs that could potentially have made the journey were grounded, and they couldn't help. Then, a telegram was sent to Whitby. The harbour master, a Captain Gibson, received it. The telegram itself reported, "A ship is being wrecked, and the crew who had taken refuge in the longboat were astern of the ship off at sea, outside the heavy breaking waves, and unable to land on account of the fearful surf." Now at Whitby, they had a seaworthy lifeboat, but again, fortune was not in their favour. As soon as they tried to launch, they found that it just wasn't possible. The strong prevailing winds were preventing it from getting where it needed to be. The coxswain at the time here in Whitby was Henry Freeman, the sole survivor of a horrible lifeboat tragedy here 20 years earlier. And he knew that if his crew couldn't get a lifeboat to Robin Hood's Bay and get it there quickly, that these men aboard this ship were going to die. So they decided that the only way they could do it was to get their lifeboat from here to Robin Hood's Bay overland. But that in 1881 was not as easy as it would have been today. This was going to be no small feat. Between Whitby and Robin Hood's Bay lay around 6 to 8 miles of small country lanes and moors. And if that wasn't going to be difficult enough, those moors were covered with huge snowdrifts. But undeterred, they gathered a huge group, which included the crew of the lifeboat, as well as relatives and locals from Whitby. And once the lifeboat had been mounted on a carriage, they gathered a group of horses to help drag it along. And in the freezing cold and swirling blizzards, their epic journey began. Now, I'm not going to try and pretend that I walked all the way to Robin Hood's Bay, because that's like a 3-4 hour walk. We drove here, but just that little drive, which only took us about 10 minutes, demonstrates just how far these people had to walk, carrying this 36-foot lifeboat. Staggering. And it's a windy but lovely day today. There aren't snowdrifts everywhere. And it's hilly around here as well. At the same time as they were making their way across country, which involved digging and smashing their way through hedges, men from Robin Hood's Bay started clearing a path from the other direction to try and meet in the middle. And as the group with the lifeboat made their way across the moor, more and more people joined in to help their effort. Local farmers arrived and everybody started to try and help clear a path for this lifeboat. Now, here I am on the coastal path that runs between Whitby and Robin Hood's Bay. There may have been some form of coastal path here back then, but even if there was, it would have been covered in deep, deep snow. So even that wouldn't have been a help. And let's say this was the path they had back then. You're still dragging a 36-foot long lifeboat, so it doesn't make it that much easier. And after this monumental effort, they finally made it to Robin Hood's Bay. And all in all, about 200 men and 18 horses dragged this lifeboat, this 36-foot long lifeboat, over snowdrifts, over the hills around here, and it took them about 3 hours. And even 3 hours, that sounds like a hell of a long time to travel 6 miles. But when you think about what they were doing and the conditions that they were doing it in, it's just incredible. But even though they'd made it to Robin Hood's Bay, they'd only completed the first part of their task. The first thing they had to do was lower the lifeboat down the cliff to the water. And this didn't prove to be an issue. But once the boat was in the water and they started heading out through the surf and the rocks, the sea was so rough that 8 oars were snapped before they could even make it close. Fortunately, the unseaworthy lifeboat that was already there had oars to replace them with, and they made their way back into the water. I don't even think it's particularly bad weather today. It is windy, but I'm sure it's been worse than this. No, it's been worse than this. But you can still hear and feel the force of these waves smashing against the rocks. And that's exactly what the men aboard this ship would have been feeling. They would have been tossed and turned in this horrible, turbulent water and waiting for hours, not sure whether rescue was even coming. But even in this second attempt, they couldn't make it all the way to the stricken men. And it was at this point that a desperate decision was made. Seeing that they couldn't get their lifeboat all the way to the men, but knowing that they were in shallow enough water that someone might be able to wade out to them, one man volunteered for the task. That was a local man named John Skelton. Skelton waded out into the lifeboat and, being a local with local knowledge, was able to guide the boat through a narrow channel to rescue the men, who at this point were so cold and in shock that they barely understood what was going on, and certainly weren't aware that they were being rescued. But every member of the crew made it back to shore alive, and the crowds of people who had helped with this epic rescue, along with almost every single person in Robin Hood's Bay, had gathered, and when they saw that the rescue had been a success, huge cheers went up as they realized that somehow, despite everything thrown in their path, they'd done it. All in all, it took them an exhausting 90 minutes to rescue all of the crew, and that's on top of the hours of dragging their lifeboat through a blizzard. In the end, this was an astonishing rescue. I mean, you just wish they could all end this well. The heroism of hundreds of people came to the aid of these stricken men, and everything had a nice happy ending. And for Coxswain Henry Freeman, this proved to be his proudest moment. And by the end of his career, he was ultimately credited with saving more than 300 lives. Ultimately, as a result of this brush with disaster, a lifeboat was reinstated at Robin Hood's Bay, where a self-righting boat called the Ephraim and Hannah Fox was put to work. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this short video, then like, subscribe, leave a nice comment, and I'll see you in the next one.